Okay, here we go. Back in the saddle with paper one revision. This is the containment timeline. This is the part one of it. We're going to pick up in 1945 and whiz through Korea, Cuba, Vietnam. Should know the drill by now. It's exactly the same as we were doing on the international relations section in between the wars. If you want, you might want to choose a different colour, perhaps for the events of Korea and Cuba and Vietnam. There is some overlap, even though it's mostly Korea first, then Cuba, then Vietnam. Certainly there's some Vietnam events that pop up in the early years as well. There is some background to do as well, but really this one is already covered on your origins of the Cold War. Timeline for paper 2. And all that stuff is exactly the same really, in terms of stuff you need to know that's going on before 45 to understand concepts. It's all about the ideological battles between communism and the West, the democratic, capitalist West, the different political ideologies, the history of mistrust, all that stuff exactly the same. We're not going into the details here, as ever. The timeline is just a fantastic quick revision aid for you guys to stick on your bedroom wall and look at as much as you can. It's not supposed to replace your notes at all, it's just a quick reminder. So make sure you know all that stuff about the different political systems and the reason why they're not natural allies. We're not going to go into origins of the Cold War stuff on here, about Berlin and Eastern Europe. This is all about containment of the spread of communism in places outside of Eastern Europe. So we're going to kick off in 1945 on this part of the timeline. Again, just going to write the dates at the top and the events here. Korea, we're looking at first, had been occupied by the Japanese. And at the end of the Second World War, it's liberated from the North and the South by the Soviets and the United States of America. The North was liberated by the Soviets, and they put in charge a man who'd been trained in Russia, Kim Il-sung, to be in charge of the communist North, and the South, which was liberated by the United States. They put Syngman Rhee in charge of a democratic capitalist South, and there's supposedly a temporary division. I have seen 4 mark questions on this, along the 38th parallel. The idea was that the two halves of Korea would be put back together at some point. That doesn't happen, obviously, still hasn't happened. But that's the essence of the crisis beginning in Korea, with these two competing systems being set up and the country divided in half. One quick nod at this stage to what's going on in Vietnam, which we'll come to in due course. This is when the Japanese are defeated. The Viet Minh, with Ho Chi Minh running the show, had been forming a resistance group throughout the war. And you could say that they liberated Vietnam from Japan at the end of the Second World War, as Japan was defeated, or certainly they inherited Vietnam again once Japan left. And they expected to have a country free of foreign occupation for the first time in a very, very long time, having been under French colonial rule for a significant period of time before the Second World War, till the Japanese took over. That's not going to happen, because the French come back in, the French returned, and Ho Chi Minh had to continue the struggle for Vietnamese independence away from foreign oppressors in Indochina. That's 1945, that's a quick intro. We're going to whiz through, nothing really to talk about until we actually get to the crunch time of 1950. We'll set up a little bit of background in 49. There are 2 major events of 1949 in terms of the communist world domination they're looking for. The USSR got the bomb, hugely boosting their confidence, and China turned communist also in 49, most populous nation on the earth, and it looked to the Americans like things were moving apace in the wrong direction for them. Before that, very ambitious to unite Korea and boost his own popularity, Kim Il-sung had actually asked in March, he'd requested permission from Stalin, it's right quite high at the top there, to invade. Stalin said no at the time. Make sure you understand why. He's occupied with the Berlin blockade that's going on in 48, 49. And obviously America are a nuclear power and the Soviets were not quite a nuclear power at that point. And so Stalin denied permission for the North to invade. And then these two things happen. The Berlin blockade ends. And so in 1950, Stalin changed his mind. And he sanctioned a North Korean communist invasion of the South, spread communism, and he put Soviet military units, or rather than units, he put Soviet military equipment and training behind the North Korean invasion, so that by 1950 they were ready to invade. One more thing I will give you there as well. By 1949, once China turns communist, another prompt to move over to Vietnam. Again, perhaps you want to choose a different colour for this. That's when the Americans start pumping money into the French war effort. They give them $500 million a year to try and fight the spread of communism. That's 49. And you can start to ask yourself something you have to know, and you can ask it 3 or 4 times during the course of this timeline. Why did the Americans get involved? Why were they so keen to stop communism spreading in Vietnam? Great 6-mark question, could turn it into a 10-mark question. Make sure you've got multiple explanations for that. That should not be tricky. But really the focus at this point is Korea. So we'll move to that Korean invasion. That was on June 25th, 1950. North Korea crossed that famous dividing line. 38th parallel, should know by now. If you know your Korean geography, as I'm sure you all do, you should know that Seoul is right up in the top left in the northwestern corner of South Korea. It's very, very close to the 38th parallel. That fell within 3 days to the North Korean advance. The American forces stationed in Korea were a joke. They were really, demobilised, demob happy at the end of the Second World War, poorly trained, not expecting any kind of conflict. And the American forces and the South Korean forces fall back very, very rapidly over the course of the next couple of months. When the invasion happens, you get an appeal from Truman to the United Nations. Appeal to the UN to try and halt this aggression and come together and give a demonstration of solidarity, and the UN do that. In July 1950 they actually passed 3 resolutions condemning the aggression, saying that it was a breach of the peace. The most important one is resolution number 84, and that's the one where they agree they will render such assistance to the Republic of Korea as may be necessary to restore international peace and security to the area, and they condemn that North Korean aggression. Make sure you understand that would not have happened if the Soviets had still been on the United Nations Security Council. America were the biggest player, they gave the most of the UN budget, they were bringing a lot of influence to bear around this point, and the Soviets weren't around because they were boycotting the UN over this. They didn't get their power of veto. Other nations had refused to let China join, or communist China join, and so the US boycotted temporarily the United Nations, lost their power of veto, and so they couldn't stop military action being taken against the North Koreans in their invasion. In total, with UN resolution number 84, there are 16 nations that gave troops, including the Brits, although it's often a forgotten war around here. There were 18 in total, so two didn't send troops who sent some form of aid. economic aid, financial aid, rather than actual military aid. It is a coalition effort, but the United States are obviously the key player. They give the bulk of the forces, and it means they also get a commanding general. That commanding general, I can hear you all saying, is Douglas MacArthur, hero of the Pacific War in World War II. Thought of himself as something as a god on Earth, and perhaps overstepped the mark on one or two occasions, but he's going to have an initially very successful entry into the Korean War. At this point, September 1950, the Communist forces have been really successful. They pushed if that's the 38th parallel, they pushed the forces of America and South Korea right back into a tiny little corner in the bottom right-hand corner in the southeast corner of South Korea. That was called the Pusan Box. And it looked like the war would be over very, very quickly. MacArthur planned a genius response to this. And behind the North Korean lines, with his new injection of United Nations troops, they launched an amphibious attack at a place called Incheon. Took North Koreans by surprise. It was very, very successful. And so as early as October 1950, the tide has been completely turned, and the UN forces had crossed the 38th parallel again to the north, and it starts this pattern of seesawing you're going to see in the Korean War. Complete opposite to the First World War, the old stalemate in the trenches, crossed by the UN forces. So the United Nations is starting to be quite successful. Communism is being rolled back. That was the goal. That was the aim of the United Nations, was to remove the aggressors from South Korea. They were successful in doing that, and then MacArthur didn't stop, and he kept going. So they've gone, they start to get close to the border between North Korea and China. That was the Yalu River, and as they approach the Yalu River, and MacArthur starts talking tough about taking the war into China and wiping out more communism, then that is going to eventually bring the Chinese into the war. It was in October 1950, before the Chinese come in actually. If you remember your good old Cold War videos, the Kenneth Branagh documentaries, you remember that MacArthur flew to meet the president at Wake Island, right in the middle of the Pacific, in between Korea and America, and he had a meeting with Truman, and Truman asked MacArthur to have lunch with him after the meeting, and he said no, turned the president down for lunch. That's how important he thought he was, that's how highly he regarded himself, that he wouldn't even sit and have lunch with the President of the United States of America. And his blunders of talking about using nukes and taking the war into China is what brings Mao Zedong, Chairman Mao, leader of China, communist leader of China. He unleashed the People's Volunteers. Technically there wasn't a declaration of war against the United States of America, but these were Chinese who freely volunteered supposedly to go over the Yalu River into North Korea to turn back the advancing tide of foreign invaders from the West. Depending on which source you read, there are, I'd say at least 200,000, over 200,000 of these people volunteered. I've seen 500,000, I've seen a million as well, but certainly great hordes of these people, and the Americans just said that they just ran out of bullets trying to stop these Chinese throwing themselves at them, and it massively intensified the war. We could have brought in, a nuclear conflict with now two major powers involved on either side. These guys are obviously supplied with Soviet hardware, Soviet military equipment, Soviet military training. There are Soviet planes flying above the skies in Korea, and you could have had a major escalation of the Cold War there. We will probably stop it there and come back for the next part.